Good morning. Going live is always so interesting. The way the camera or the timer works on this. It's like, okay, you're 3 minutes in. Oh, let's start all over again. So, welcome back. This is a interesting day. I was looking yesterday to see what the talk was going to be about, and it came to me to talk about polarity and duality with regard to The Wizard of Oz. And it really is just such a rich story, archetypal, obviously, published by Frank Baum in 1900. And so, one of the things that I find so fascinating about the story is that it's been with us since 1900 and really has been seen all over the world in terms of the movie. But when I first started working with it, it was the second story I worked with. The first was, uh, what was it? Rose White and Rose Red? That doesn't sound right. It was something like that. It was the first story I worked with. And then the second I went with The Wizard of Oz, and not with the movie, but with the book. And very soon after I began it, it was so obvious that the story is symbolic and that he didn't write it. The symbolism was so intricate and so perfectly woven together that it would be impossible. Even I've got now 20 plus years of experience with symbolism, and I couldn't consciously write a story that was that detailed in terms of the symbolism. And I did eventually come across something that Frank Baum said, it just came to me. So that story was something that was really for our times, and really to assist us in the transformation of consciousness, like the fairy tales, but I think almost to an even larger degree than the fairy tales themselves, because of the universality of it. To have it be seen all over the world suggests how the content of the story was so relatable, regardless almost of where you come from. When we talk about the fairy tales, lots of times, I mention like in the West because that's what I know. But with this story, it didn't stay here. It did transfer to other cultures as well. So that's really interesting aspect of this story for sure. So we see polarity and duality right from the very beginning in terms of the Christian story, which I've mentioned before, in the Garden of Eden in Genesis. And the fact that the story very early on goes from that kind of initial all good unitary consciousness right into duality shows you how important that is to the transformation of consciousness on this planet. What we see in that story, as I've mentioned before, is that in the beginning it was created and it was all good. Then they put Adam in the garden, and then Adam is lonely. So right there we have that first initial separation, because there can't be loneliness if you're in unity consciousness. That doesn't happen. And if you think about it, he should have been in unity consciousness with God because he was in the garden. So the idea that Eve came along and that then the serpent came along and that all that needed to happen in order to awaken to the knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil was already, not the knowledge of it, the good and evil was already there, but then what needed to happen was it needed to come to consciousness. So that's how our life works as well. And this is what we're going to see in The Wizard of Oz as well. And to a degree, never to this extent have I talked about the polarity. in the way that this works in terms of transforming consciousness. But in this situation, you can see how it had already happened. And then the snake said, basically, as I said before, the Gnostic saw as the teacher said, eat the apple, and then they became aware. Then they covered themselves, they saw that they were different, and they became separate from God. Which wasn't true because that can't happen. So it was just a fall essentially in consciousness. The idea of duality is just thought. It's not like it has validity in the way that we think it has validity. So this is also when you see the separation between the above and the below, the in and the out, and those kinds of separations you see from the very beginning. So you go from the unitary that is often perceived as an initial Ouroboros consciousness. That's like the baby that comes that right after it's born has this kind of unity with mother. It doesn't have a sense of she's separate from me, like everything in the world is me as a baby. Then comes the fall when there's an understanding that there's separation, and then once you go through that, all of life is basically awakening you to the reality that you weren't separate. And so it's trying to dissolve and challenge the ways that we perceive as separate. And then that separation would return us to a sense, that separation would be to return us to a sense of unity, but from a place of more consciousness, as opposed to being unconscious, having that unconscious unity that you have like as an infant. So generativity in The Wizard of Oz, as we've seen in so many other fairy tales, really is at the opening of the story. We open up on the Kansas prairie with Aunt Em and Uncle Henry. And they are childless. They are as gray as the prairie, which is really interesting because what you have here is too much solar consciousness, too much sun, too much doing. You have to work hard to survive. So you can see how this really dovetails right in with the story of the garden and in Genesis, right? This is what happened. There was this, now there's just so much emphasis on the masculine that basically the color has drained out of them. The color has drained out of everything there because of the level of solar consciousness that's there. So this is the world that we live in right now. That's why it's such a popular story, is because this is happening really on a global level. So what happens is they adopt Dorothy. So this is what happens in consciousness. That's why I really wanted to look at this story. It's really showing us how in consciousness the patterns and the way that things transform. This is basically revealing the underlying structure of transforming consciousness. So what happens in consciousness is, like, let's say that there's too much solar, then something gets introduced. I'm sorry, my nose is so itchy. Something gets introduced, and that is something that's different than the environment that's existing initially. So what gets introduced then is Dorothy. And Dorothy is adopted by Aunt Em and Uncle Henry. And Aunt Em very early on is challenged by this situation, right? So this is a triggering situation. Something has come in to the environment in order to trigger what's unseen and what is unknown. This is like the snake coming into the garden. Dorothy plays that role in this particular moment, in this particular part of the story. And what she does is she's showing Aunt Em what has happened to her. So what's interesting about this, besides everything else, what's also interesting, I should say, is that Dorothy could be the heroine, but in a way you could almost see Aunt Em as the heroine too, because Aunt Em is the one who is seeing through the presence of Dorothy what has been lost in herself. And the book is so interesting the way that they put it, and they say that she basically tries to stifle a scream when she sees Dorothy and how Dorothy is acting. And Dorothy hasn't basically been in that solar consciousness for long enough. She's the fact that she's adopted suggests that she's just come in. She hasn't been here for years. And so she hasn't had that overexposure to the solar consciousness in a way that would make her look like everything else. And when Aunt Em sees her, she recognizes what she has lost, and she remembers. She becomes conscious of the fact that, oh, this is the way I used to be, and I'm not that way anymore. And so that's like that critical moment. So you can see this in your own life when you are too out of balance, and life wants you in balance, right? So this is the polarity we were talking about. So here in this situation, there are these extremes, and on the one end, it's like they're living over here, and then Dorothy comes in and she's over here. She's on the. It's not, look how interesting that is. See how dark my hand is here and how light my hand is here. So then, what the story will want to do is we'll be trying to bring these polarities together, and that's what life is doing as well. So she recognizes, she becomes aware. The snake comes in to bring the teach, to show what has been unconscious and bring it to consciousness. So the prairie itself is solar. It is sun-baked. There are no trees, there are no shade. So that would be the ability to get out of the sun would be what the tree would create, would be that shade, and that would be the opposite. But there's nothing there to do that. It's desolate. Nothing is growing. There are no trees. There's just everything is there is some kind of prairie grass, I guess it is, but it's just gray. It's not like it has color. It's not like it's green. And because of this lack of trees and nourishing nature for animals or insects, and you can imagine it would be really parched and devoid of really much wildlife. So there's nothing growing there for miles, and you can't see anything for miles. They had to bring the wood in to build the house from far away, like, because there's just no resources there. You get that sense of isolation and struggle. The house is also just portrayed as just the same. It's gray, it's sun-baked, the paint has peeled off. Inside, there's 2 beds, there is a cook stove, there's a chair and 3 chairs and a table, like nothing else, really the bare essentials. So you get the idea that there's just, these people are surviving. They're not able to move beyond that, and that here, this is really a portrayal of that lack of generativity that we see so often in stories. So when there's too much on the one side, which we saw in so many of the fairy tales, there's no new life being created. So this is how the psyche, this is how life works with the psyche in order to generate new life, because what it wants is for you to become conscious and for you to thrive. And when that's not happening, there has to be an intervention by life in order to make that happen and that come about. So the house is gray and sun-baked, it's sparse, there's nothing inside. You really get that sense that that's what life is like, and that this is just a reflection of the inner life in the outer, right? We've talked before about how there's this seamlessness. We have this idea of this separation between above and below and in and out that actually doesn't exist. And so this is just a reflection of what's happening inside as well. So too much work, working too hard, too much sun, too much masculine energy, too much doing, and they're scratching out an existence, which means they're really in lack and poverty consciousness. So something new has to happen, something new that does not belong, something that does not fit with the current narrative gets introduced. And what can happen at that point is resistance and an attempt to discredit and discount whatever new information is entering into consciousness. This can be challenging to see and challenging to be aware of, because there is a certain conditioned response to seeing things that we're used to seeing in the way that we're used to seeing them. So often what's different is rejected and pushed away. But like with on M, that moment of clarity can sometimes come, but isn't actually followed through. So that moment that she has that awareness can go right, the awareness can go right back into the unconscious. And if you look at your own life, you may be able to see this. You may be able to say, oh yeah, I remember that time. I knew I shouldn't have done that, or I knew I should have done that. And I remember thinking I shouldn't or should have. And then you did it anyway. But that's one of those moments where it comes to consciousness, but then immediately goes back into the unconscious, and the habitual way of operating or acting comes right back in, and you go forward without actually really taking in that unusual information, really taking in that sense of this is something I need to pay attention to or listen to, and act differently than I might in the past. So something new, something that doesn't belong comes in, and that really is Dorothy and Toto, because they are so opposite. The polarity, they are the opposite of what is happening on the prairie. So it's really interesting if you think about it, because that wasn't there. So it was this particular way, the opposite thing comes in, and it's a moment to grow and evolve and change. So it really, the response needs to be to open to that moment and to receive the moment and allow it to really land and see what's happening here. And so often when we're in this kind of conditioned habitual way of acting in life, we don't pause to take in these moments of new information that have the capacity to really transform us and create greater consciousness for us. So they are portrayed as life, like life, alive, joyful, playful, right? If you're working so hard to survive, you don't have time and energy to play. And so they represent that carefree, lighthearted, childlike part of us that as we enter into adulthood, most of us kind of lose contact with that. And so life is trying to reconnect us to the part of us that felt free and alive and joyful and excited and curious, and all of these things that kind of tend to get dissolved and disintegrated as we become practical and responsible and really conditioned by the culture that is childish, and we have to become like adults. And so it's really understanding that there are aspects of that consciousness that even in Christianity talks about becoming like children to enter the kingdom. And that's what that means, to reconnect with that aspect of childhood that trusted, that loved, that was open-hearted, right? So the catalyst for change appears when it's needed. And as I said, if we're open to it and aware and reflective of what's happening in our life, then we can see that and respond to it. So what happens next is Uncle Henry is sitting on the stoop, Aunt Em is in the kitchen, and Dorothy stands on the threshold. So a threshold symbolically represents a transitional space, a transitional time, right? It's a transition from the inner and the outer. Isn't that so cool? Aunt Em is the inner, and that's the feminine. Aunt Uncle Henry is the outer, and that's the masculine. And so here we have, and then she represents that bridge, the bridge between the polarities. And so here they stand as the in the inner and the outer, her on the threshold. And what happens is Uncle Henry notices that the wind is changing, and there is a warm wind coming from the south. The south represents the solar and the masculine and that end of the polarity. And the wind also at the same time then comes from the north, which represents the feminine, and the cold wind. So the hot wind and the cold wind come together and they form a tornado. What's really interesting is that, since most of you already know the story, I'm not ruining anything, spoiler alert, in the Oz, the north and south is the region of the good witches. So they represent they're really indicating the fact that the winds come from those directions, that those energies that are creating this transformative moment are coming from the good. They're not even, you don't even see the polarity of good and bad in that sense, is that the origin, what's underneath what's happening, is all good, right? Because it's both ends are coming from that place. So despite the fact that we might say the shadow is negative and the consciousness is positive, it isn't, because beneath all of that represents that region that means it comes from the good, what was in the beginning. And as they say in Revelation, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. So that represents that's the underlying energy of everything that's coming to consciousness. So the good witch domain, solar and lunar, masculine and feminine. On M is Uncle Henry is outside, and on M is inside, and Dorothy is on the threshold. So the tornado is coming to move this story forward because there's this stuckness. So this is an opportunity for the story to progress forward, and the catalyst for that is the tornado. What is the tornado going to show us? It's going to show us what happens in consciousness, what happens to this family when they're threatened. And that represents what happens to us as well. So when something comes in that is perceived as a threat, what is the response to that? And that response often is indicative of a family pattern, of an ancestral pattern, of a cultural pattern. And often those things overlap in a lot of ways. So we see in our own lives that we can see through this lens that if you're in too one-sided of a situation, there's this introduction of something new, which is the catalyst to move us forward. So whether it's Dorothy, the Toto, or the tornado. So the pattern is getting triggered with this situation. And when the tornado comes, or Uncle Henry senses this shift in the atmosphere, then he says he's going to run to take care of the animals in the barn. On M, throws open the storm cellar door and heads for the storm cellar. That represents the unconscious. So what is the response in the family to this fear that's generated by this threat? And that is he flies, he runs away, she goes to hide. So she's in that mode, and she calls to Dorothy to follow. Once again, here we have an intervention by fate, and fate says, no, this time. And historically what you would see is that to have the pattern repeat, Dorothy would have gone with on M into the storm cellar. But since we're breaking the pattern here, what happens is Toto runs in the other direction and Dorothy goes after him. And that creates, again, that moment where fate says, no, we're not going to go down this way anymore. And it kind of closes the door on that by having Toto run in another direction. So she's on M's in the unconscious. Dorothy chases Toto, and while she's going after Toto, the tornado comes and picks up the house. So that means like she's not going into that unconscious. And she's in the house and she's afraid, she's flying up in the air. And at one point, she's afraid, and the door opens and Toto falls through. But the wind keeps him from actually going anywhere. So she's able to just reach in and grab him and closes the door. So, in essence, which is interesting, the first time that happens, she doesn't have a part in it. It just happens, of its own accord. The second time, she's kind of making the choice to close the door herself. And at that point in the story, she chooses to go lay down in her bed and go to sleep, which means I'm going to surrender to this situation. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm here, and this is out of my control. This is basically life taking over, and the only choice that you have at that point is how you're going to respond to the situation. Aunt Em is gone, Uncle Henry is gone, and she's been removed from the situation that has the pattern, and now she has an opportunity to respond in a new way, which she does, which is to surrender. And to surrender means trust. So that's what you don't see with Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, is trusting life, because that's what the work is, the effort, the attention to doing and going and trying to survive. Is they have to do it alone, and it's not happening for them, so to speak. So once the new response comes, then there's an opportunity now for something else to happen. So when the house comes down is when she wakes up with a jolt, and she opens the door, which again places her on a threshold. So she's in this moment, again, a transitory moment between the inner and the outer. And it is the exact opposite of Kansas. So see, there's so much polarity in this story, especially in the beginning. It's so cool to see. So Kansas is the solar consciousness, and Munchkin Land is life. It is just, this is what life should look like. There are fruiting trees, there are babbling brooks, there are singing birds. Like, life is in full technicolor. And she's standing on the threshold, and she can see this, she can hear it, she can, like, all of your senses come alive. Where everything was dead in Kansas, now here we are just in thriving life. This is the opposite of what you found on the Kansas prairie. And so this is an opportunity for her to really be aware and take it in, right? We said, like with Aunt Em, that moment that she becomes conscious of the situation and she doesn't really take it in and allow it to change her, she doesn't, because she goes into the unconscious, which is the pattern, which is what always happens. So in this moment, Dorothy steps across the threshold into this new world, essentially, and she sees the exact opposite of what was there before. And she sees the Munchkins, and the Good Witch comes. And the Good Witch says, basically, thank you for killing the Wicked Witch. And Dorothy's like, I didn't do it. I'm just a little girl. I can't do anything like that. So again, right at the beginning of the story, we see a disempowerment of the heroine. She doesn't believe that she has power. She doesn't believe that she has the ability to do something like that. So this witch, and the fact that she's died, means that she was tied. She was tied to the initial situation and was part of the reason that there was so much desolate life. There was no life on the Kansas prairie. So her death is a catalyst as well. So all of these things you could see almost as like the dominoes beginning to fall. And so first you have Dorothy show up, and then you have the tornado come, and then you have the surrender, and then you have the witch who dies. And she can't take that on as a part of her own identity. Her identity is not big enough at this point to accept that she has that power. And so she pushes that away and doesn't take it in. So this will have to come back again because she's not assimilating that information and saying, yes, in fact, this is a part of me too. The other new character that comes is the Good Witch, who has the ability to access intuition. And she's the one that says, Dorothy says, of course, she wants to go home. And the Good Witch says, you'll have to go see the wizard. And so the Good Witch represents the ability to access new information. And that would be the feminine. And the feminine then has the ability, the capacity to receive, which doesn't happen on the prairie. So this isn't something new as well. She receives information that gives answers to situations that haven't been encountered before. So because we have left the old behind, because we have left the family consciousness, the ancestral consciousness, the parental consciousness, we see this over and over again with where the heroine has to leave home. She has to leave that old consciousness. But when she does that, like in the Handless Maiden, when she does leave home, what happens is she's in an entire new situation and there's no precedent. When we're in a situation that's familiar, we have precedents. We know we've been here before. We know what to do. But in a new situation, there is no precedent. And the only way to navigate through it in a new way in order to grow and not regress is to be able to access the intuition to go forward into something new and go into a new way. So dreams are another way to access information on this level. With the dreams, they can be the catalyst. So life sometimes can be a little bit more disruptive because it's on a physical level, but the dreams are still working at the energetic level. So when you're working at the energetic level, you have the ability to be processing these situations and integrating the information that comes in a way that is not quite so challenging sometimes because it's not at the level of the physical. The information, like something like Dorothy, can come, and I've had clients who've had dreams like this where there's information about, like, here's a character that is very different from how they operate in the world. And this character that enters the dream has the qualities that need to be integrated by the dreamer. And so that would be what Dorothy would represent. Like, how do we integrate the qualities associated with her? How does she respond? How does she, like, she represents like a beginner's mind. She doesn't have all that baggage that the conditioned mind does, the conditioned roles. So that's a transformative moment to be able to take in, even through the dream, what is the new thing that's coming to consciousness. So her, as you know, most of you know from the story, as the story evolves, Dorothy will have to encounter the witch again, which was the second Wicked Witch, in order to resolve that, taking back her power from the places that she's projected it. So what's really interesting is that life has a way of really trying to maneuver us and manage how we navigate through life. One of the stories that I thought of in my own life that was so similar and relevant was, not that I was living in the Kansas prairie or encountered the witch, but when I was at one point after I had gotten divorced, I was going to go back and finish a master's degree in counseling psychology. And it was in another area from where I was living at the time. And I went down and I had to stay in a hotel, a residence hotel, and was trying to get everything organized and could not find a place to live. It just made no sense. I was working with a realtor. I was looking through the newspaper. It was in a very populated area. And the fact that we couldn't find a decent place for me to live was just like, neither one of us, we were both perplexed. Like, how is this even possible? But what was one of the things that was so fascinating about this was that before I went down to this area, I was driving to take my dogs to leave them with a friend. And as I was driving to her house, became aware of how three different cars, right in succession, made U-turns in front of me. And so I was thinking, like, okay, this is crazy that three would happen right in front of me, like one after the other, three different cars. And I thought to myself, okay, what does this mean? Does this mean don't go back and finish that degree? Or does this mean go back and finish that degree? I was like, which U-turn is it? Is it that I'm doing the right thing and going the right way? Or am I supposed to turn around and go back to where I was? If that things if those things stayed with me, then what would have happened was, before that, I had gone to visit another state, which was not far away, and went for the day to just, check out the area. And on my way there, I had a message and it said, I'm looking for a place to live. And I was like, I'm not looking for a place to live. So this was before I decided to go back and try and finish the degree. So I'm like, I'm not looking for a place to live. And so I go up to this town and I walk around town, then I go to this coffee shop. And at this coffee shop, the people sitting at the next table we start chit-chatting, and their couple is like, oh, we're moving here from someplace else. So again, like, it wasn't landing. So the fact that I had that thought, then go home, and there's a message on my answering machine, and it's from the owner of the cottage, and she says, we're going to turn it into a summer rental, so you can come back in the fall, but you're going to have to move for the summer. And I was like, I still didn't get it. It still was not landing. Like, okay, you're being guided to move to this other place. So I decide I'm going to go down and finish this degree. I do everything I can to make it work, and it wouldn't work. No matter what I did, I ended up, like, couldn't find a place to live. Go down there. I'm living in the hotel. I decide, okay, out of desperation, I go back to the apartment complex that I lived in when I was single, before I even got married. They had one apartment. They probably have over 200 apartments in this complex. They have one apartment available. It's the apartment I used to live in. Not only that, but they can't find a key to open the door to the apartment. I mean, it was just this ongoing series of, the door was not opening. It just was not going to open. And so this is how life molds us and guides us in a way. And if we're not aware of it, and if we're not getting it, we're not open to it, and that we don't take that information and respond to it. It wasn't until I went for a session with an acupuncturist that I was able to really calm down my nervous system enough to dial in. And I walked out of the appointment with the acupuncturist, and I was like, oh, I need to leave. Like, this is not my path. And it wasn't, and it never had been. And I had, the whole time I had been in this degree program, I had been like, this isn't right, this doesn't feel right, this isn't for me. And I kept getting talked out of it. So you can see how really being aware and open to things that, in hindsight, just obviously, you're probably shaking your head going, really? You didn't get all that? No, I didn't. But in hindsight, it's all clear. It was so clear. I was like, I can't believe I didn't get that. But that polarity, like, life kept trying to introduce and guide me towards greater consciousness, towards greater awareness, towards what was going to be in more alignment, more like, really, and not to go learn, not to go get that degree. That would have been in the masculine consciousness. It was saying, don't go to the masculine consciousness. Go this other way. But I didn't listen. But that's the downside. But the upside is, I have a great story to tell about how not listening isn't helpful. So, yeah. So I hope this has been okay. I got a message. So something's up with the connection here. But anyway. Well, that would be it for our polarity, duality, and how unity consciousness is created in the psyche. So, It was a lovely day. I love The Wizard of Oz, and I'm so happy to share it with you. Hopefully, you got something out of that, and I hope you have a lovely Saturday. Take care.